Militants linked to the Islamic State leading an insurgency in northern Mozambique have kidnapped hundreds of boys and taken them to camps for training. The jihadist group says, known locally as Al-Shabaab, has been terrorizing Mozambique's gas-rich Cabo Delgado region since 2017, raiding villages and towns in efforts to establish a caliphate there. Local sources told Human Rights Watch that some of the boys abducted were as young as 12 years old. To date, more than 3,000 people have died in the insurgency, many of them civilians, and at least 800,000 have been displaced from their homes in the past 4 years. Shocking revelations. To tell us more about this, we're joined by Southern Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, Dewa Mavhinga. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. Al-Shabaab's growing use of children as fighters is the latest horrifying chapter in the Cabo Delgado violence, really speaking to some very serious concerns. What do you make of it?
Well, it is a shocking discovery that we have made that the ISIS-linked group in northern Mozambique is forcing young boys cruelly and unlawfully to be involved in the conflict. This has included abductions and kidnappings of young boys as young as 12 and taking them to camps and training them to use weapons and to fight in this conflict. So it's quite horrendous and horrific that young boys are being subjected to such cruel and criminal enterprise.
These young boys are being hunted, essentially. You'll hear stories of some of the boys saying that they were found as they were in hiding, really speaking to a human rights violation, that they cannot live freely, they cannot live like normal teenagers and young boys because there are fears of them being snatched.
Absolutely. So the young boys are afraid, their families are afraid, and you will know that because of this conflict, schooling has been disrupted, and therefore the rights to education have been stopped, and the young boys cannot live freely, cannot enjoy their basic rights, and they are hunted, they are kidnapped, and hundreds have already been subjected to this cruel treatment. They have been forced to train, to carry weapons, to use weapons, and we now know that in some of the more recent attacks, including the attacks in March on Palma, on the Palma town, there was the forcible, unlawful use of young boys in that attack. And we have also been speaking to families and to some of the young boys, survivors, who have told us horrific stories of how they were subjected to these kidnappings and forced to carry and to use weapons. And this is something that we have discovered that it is happening, it is spreading, and it has become the latest tactic and crime that is being committed by this armed Islamic group in northern Mozambique, in the province of Cabo Delgado.
For instance, in the town of Palma, some parents say that they watch their sons wield guns when they returned with other fighters to attack the village. And you also hear stories of how some of the young men say that in some instances they are able to escape, but then they live in fear of being recaptured. Really a very helpless situation here where parents cannot do anything to help. What are the options? What are the solutions? How can you, as a Human Rights Watch, also weigh in there to bring this to some sort of a close, especially as every single day young men live in fear?
Well, I think what's important is that the young boys and their families, their parents, should be protected as citizens in Mozambique, and the Mozambican government, the authorities, have a lawful obligation to ensure that there is protection. And it is encouraging that now there is also the SADC mission in Mozambique, SAMIM, which is also helping the Mozambican authorities to try and bring control and sanity to the area and to end the conflict. So what we really want as human rights actors is that the conflict should end and that young people should be protected and their rights should be secured and guaranteed. And this should happen as soon as possible, because what is happening on the ground that we are discovering is simply horrific, horrendous, and unacceptable. And the international community should be supporting these efforts by SADC and the Mozambican authorities to ensure that this conflict comes to an end and human rights are protected in a more sustainable way.
What are some of the really pressing challenges in containing a situation like this? I mean, we know the impact of Al-Shabaab throughout the continent and their capability.
Yes, and of course, what's perhaps unique about northern Mozambique and why this conflict has raged on since October 2017 has been also partly the failure by the Mozambican authorities to assert the authority, and rampant corruption and the weakness of the security forces there, and the delays by SADC to intervene and ensure that there is sufficient support. But now that we have these things in place, we hope that there will be a swift movement towards ending this conflict. But of course, because of this guerrilla approach, in which the Al-Shabaab group is embedded in the communities, sometimes hiding people in the communities, it is much more difficult to root out. But we hope that now is the time and that there will be sufficient resources and support to ensure that this conflict is swiftly brought to an end and does not spread any further, and that no children, young boys are used in this conflict, and those that have been abducted, kidnapped, are safely returned to their parents and their communities.
What do we know about international laws when it comes to the use of child soldiers in military conflicts?
Well, it's clearly criminal and unlawful and should not be happening, and those responsible should be held accountable for engaging in that cruel action. And so there is a clear international law obligation that children should not in any way be used in conflict, and that school facilities should not be used in conflict, and that in as much as is possible, children should be allowed to live their normal lives in conflict-free situations. So this is one of the international crimes and crimes against humanity that is now being committed by this Al-Shabaab ISIS-linked armed group in northern Mozambique.
The conflict in the Cabo Delgado region has really had a major and detrimental impact on children, not only boys as young as 12, but also we've seen that young girls, about 50 or so of them, have also been kidnapped during this time. I mean, how much do you know about that, and what really is at stake there?
Well, you are quite right that since October 2017, there has been a massive humanitarian crisis that has unfolded as a result of this armed conflict and the activities of this Al-Shabaab group. And we know that this has also heavily, negatively impacted on girls and boys, and that, girls have been subjected to sexual abuse. So there have been sexual crimes there, including rape, and we know that there has been no accountability. So this conflict has had a huge toll in terms of human rights abuses for the communities concerned, particularly the children. And of course, we know that schools have been shut down, hospital and other health facilities have been disrupted and shut down. And so it has been very difficult, even for groups supporting and providing assistance, humanitarian assistance to communities, to young people, to children, have had it very difficult to access these communities because of the levels of insecurity. So it's not just that there have been these massive abuses, but also that communities have been left to fend for themselves, unable to escape and unable to receive aid, much needed aid, because the area has been rendered unsafe for humanitarian organizations to be able to do their work freely and without interference. And without, having to worry about the security of their staff who will be working in those areas.
Absolutely, some really horrifying, shocking revelations there coming out of the impact of Al-Shabaab in Mozambique. That was a Southern African director at Human Rights Watch, Dewa Mavhinga, painting the full picture for us. Thank you so much for your time.